In this video, we're going to talk about active and passive transport. Transport, whether active or passive, is a biological process where the cell is moving molecules inside and outside of the cell membrane. The nuts and bolts of the subject is this. Active transport requires energy and passive transport does not. First, we're going to talk about something called free diffusion. Let me say this first. Free diffusion only pertains to small nonpolar molecules like oxygen or carbon. They can pass through the nonpolar cell membrane on their own without any other type of assistance. There's another type of diffusion we will talk about in a minute that pertain to molecules that are large and or polar and can't pass through the cell membrane on their own. Now on to the topic. Diffusion is the natural tendency of molecules to move from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. In other words, if there is a large amount of small nonpolar molecule inside the cell and not many of that same molecule outside the cell, those molecules are going to want to spread out to the other side of the cell wall. This works the other way as well. If there are a lot of a specific molecule outside the cell and not many of that specific molecule inside the cell, then the molecules will try to spread into the available space inside the cell as well. I think of it like this. If the solution in the cell is on a bus and the molecules are people, each of the people getting on the bus are going to want their own personal space, so they're going to want to spread out on the available seats. Diffusion is one type of passive transport, and it is called passive because it doesn't require any energy because of the molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. It's kind of like going uphill versus downhill in a car. When you go uphill, you have the engine has to work harder to maintain speed, using more fuel and energy. Conversely, when you go downhill, the car can maintain speed and in some cases even gain speed without even pressing on the accelerator, using no fuel or energy. This is really simplified explanation of passive transport and diffusion. As promised earlier, I'll talk about the other type of diffusion, which is called facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion applies to molecules that are large and or polar and cannot pass through the cell membrane on their own. Because the cell membrane is nonpolar and the phospholipids that make it are packed tightly together, large polar molecules can't pass through without any help. But because they are still molecules in the solution, they still want to diffuse and spread out into all the available space. So just like with free diffusion, the molecules will still want to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Free diffusion is also a form of passive transport. Remember the car going uphill versus downhill. This is the same thing. The only difference is these molecules need help being able to move through the cell membrane, and they get that help from special proteins embedded in the cell membrane called transmembrane proteins. These proteins create channels for large polar molecules like glucose or sodium to be able to move through the cell membrane. One thing to remember here is that there are many different types of transmembrane proteins, and each of them is for a specific type of molecule. This specific type keeps these transmembrane proteins from being an open gate for just any molecules to use to pass through the cell membrane. There is one type of transmembrane protein I want to talk about, that is because it is a critical portion of osmosis. Osmosis is the last example I have of passive transport, and it still follows the same rule of not needing energy because the molecules are going from a high concentration to an area of lower concentration. Osmosis is specifically the diffusion of solvent molecules, in this case water, through a cell membrane. Now because water molecules are polar, molecules that can't pass through the cell membrane on their own, and they need some help from a transmembrane protein, osmosis is a type of facilitated diffusion. The specific transmembrane protein used by water molecules are called aquaporins. Aquaporins conduct water molecules and only water molecules very rapidly into and out of the cell. Water doesn't just sit inside of the cell, it is constantly in motion, and that motion is what we call osmosis. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the other side of the transport coin, which is active transport. Active transport requires energy, usually in the form of ATP, because in active transport we are moving molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. Remember the example of the car driving uphill and downhill? This is the uphill portion, whereas passive transport is the downhill portion. Another way to think of it is like this. It takes you no energy to sit in a boat and go downstream, letting the current carry you. But if you turn the boat around and start going upstream, you're going to have to paddle or expend energy to get the boat to go anywhere. Another thing to mention here is that the faster the current, the greater the difference in concentration levels, is then the harder you are going to have to paddle to get upstream. Use more energy. This also works in the opposite way for passive transport. The faster the current, lower the concentration, then the faster the rate of diffusion. There are a few types of active transport to talk about, so let's get started. Active transport happens through special transmembrane called carrier proteins. Carrier proteins differ from channel proteins in the fact that they actually have to pump molecules uphill from a low concentration area to a high concentration area. Channel proteins, on the other hand, just have to open and allow molecules to flow through them in a downhill fashion without any real work involved. So here's another example for you to understand. If you think about a gas station, the tanks with all the fuel in it is below your car underground. In order to get the fuel from the underground tank to your car, the gas pump has to pump the fuel from a low area of concentration, underground tank, to a high area, your car. One type of carrier protein worth talking about is the sodium Na positive, potassium K positive pump. An animal cell likes to have high concentration of K positive and a low concentration of Na positive inside of it. In order to maintain this steep ratio of K positive to Na positive, the cell membrane has a special carrier protein that acts like a pump to carry Na positive out of the cell and bring K positive into the cell. Because there is no Na positive in the extracellular matrix outside of the cell than there is on the inside, this carrier protein has to work and expend energy to keep moving sodium molecules into an area that already has a high concentration of sodium. The same thing happens with potassium, just in the opposite direction. There is a high concentration of potassium inside the cell already when compared to extracellular matrix, so the carrier protein has to work to pump more in. Another type of transport I want to touch on is called bulk transport. Bulk transport is its own kind of transport, but involves the cell doing work and expending energy in the form of ATP. So consider it a form of active transport. In a nutshell, bulk transport consists of endo and exocytosis. I'm talking about these two because they are essentially the same thing that happen in the same way. The only difference is in endo, inside the cell is bringing molecules into itself. And in exo, outside the cell is moving molecules outside of the cellular membrane. Bulk transport is used for the movement of large molecules like proteins and polysaccharides that are A, way too big for a carrier protein to move, and B, need to contain and separate it from everything else inside of the cell. Let me give you a quick down and dirty explanation of what happens in bulk transport. We'll use exocytosis, molecules being moved from the inside to the outside of the cell for an example. Pretend we're talking about a pancreas cell. The pancreas makes insulin. Insulin is a signaling hormone that tells your cell to absorb sugar. So because you don't want insulin floating around and doing whatever it wants and sending bad info to all the cells in your body, it needs to be contained. The pancreas cell creates the insulin and a carrier and a container to carry it in called a vesicle. This vesicle is made of the Golgi apparatus and the cell membrane. The vesicle is basically made from some of the lipids from the cell membrane and is nothing more than a container to carry molecules in. A very simple, basic comparison is putting leftover food molecules into some Tupperware vesicle. The creation of the vesicle takes work and therefore requires energy by expending by the cell, making endoexocytosis a form of active transport. I hope this helps you understand passive and active transport better. Thanks for your time.